Hi, I'm Karen Plater, and I want to welcome you today to the Presbyterian Church in Canada's webinar, Help, We Have a Deficit. Today, we're going to give you strategies to help you move forward from deficit to new possibilities. I'm Karen Plater. I'm Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving, and I've been doing this work for the past 15 years at the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And the 11 years before that, I was the Communications Coordinator for Presbyterian World Service and Development. So I've been over 26 years at the national office. I'm also a farmer that has 3 horses, 12 chickens, and 14, soon to maybe be 16 goats on my farm. I also like to dabble in writing, and I'm happy to talk to you today.
Hi, I'm Lori Gunther-Reeser. I research Christian giving for my doctorate, and I've worked in charity and churches for my whole career. I'm an author, a speaker, a consultant, and you can check out my website if you want to know more.
Today, we're looking at what's a deficit. And I realized when I was talking to the presbytery clerks a few weeks ago that we can have different definitions of what a deficit is. And there are different ways that you can have a deficit. So first of all, you can have a deficit in your budget. So your budget is your plan for mission and ministry over the year. And a deficit budget is one that has anticipated income less than the planned expenses. And there may be different reasons that you have this deficit budget, but that's what it is. Then also we have the financial statements. So the financial statements are what actually happens. And so you have a deficit financial statement when your actual annual income was less than your operating expenses. Now, this deficit may be covered by savings or restricted funds that you have in your church that you may show balance out through your balance statement. But you could just know that if you say, I've got a deficit financial statement, that's what we're talking about. Annual income less than operating expenses. It could also be covered by a loan. Some churches are taking out loans, and if you're taking out a loan to cover a deficit, it's important that your congregation know that. Now, we can have planned versus unexpected deficit. So a planned budget or a planned deficit would be one where you've actually done a deficit budget, and there's an intentional reason that you are doing that. Perhaps you have a surplus from a previous year that you want to cover. Perhaps you're expecting or hoping that there will be new sources of income throughout the year. But for whatever reason, you've decided intentionally to pass a deficit budget. Now, I'm going to talk about later about whether that's a good idea or not a good idea, but it's a planned deficit. And then you might have an unexpected deficit. Maybe there was something that happened throughout the year that wasn't expected, so your costs were larger than expected, or perhaps somebody died and some of the income that normally came in wasn't there that year. So that could be an unexpected deficit. The other thing that I'll throw in is that sometimes you can have continuous. It's different if you have 1 year of a deficit and then your next year is fine, you make adjustments in your budget and things are good, versus ones that continually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of deficit. That's saying something different about your congregation. And I'm saying this because when we say we have a deficit, it's important to know what we're talking about and if we're speaking the same language. Because I have heard from many people before, as soon as they hear the word deficit, a red flag goes up. Oh, there's a crisis. There's something wrong. We need to address this. So what's the story that a deficit tells? All right, this is an important thing to know. Well, I think when we hear that there's a deficit, we have that there isn't enough. Not enough resources. We don't have enough income to cover our expenses. We're in a crisis. If you're having troubles with the poll, don't worry about it. It's sort of just a fun thing, and we're just going to keep on going. And if we have a deficit, we need to do something. People do not want to see a deficit in consecutive years. They want to hear that this is a good, that we're growing, that we're going somewhere, that there's exciting things happening in the church. And when they hear deficit, they don't hear that. They hear that there isn't enough. So we need to do something. So let's go on to the next one. If we need to do something, there's 2 things that we can do. We can either raise the income or we can cut the costs. And I can say little too often in many of the congregations I've been in or I visited and have attended myself, once there's a deficit, it immediately turns to what costs can we cut? And where can we cut the costs and how can we cut our costs? And the tone of the conversation, it goes downhill quickly. It's never fun. People start to argue about what's important in the church. They start to look for little things. How much are we spending on postage? How much is the snow clearing costs? Are we doing enough? Like, yeah, can we do with less personnel? What about the building? Can we close section of it off? It's never a fun conversation when you get into these conversations. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So let's look at these few options. I'm going to turn it over to Lori to talk a little bit about raising income. And one of the myths we have, and that she and myself, and I know Jim, when we go into congregations, and when I've been in a congregation, is like, we hear it all the time. Everyone's on a fixed income. Everyone's giving all they can. Raising income, it's one of the last things that we think about when we have a deficit. And we all think that that's a little bit of a myth. So Lori's going to explore that with us.
Thanks, Karen. So this is a little bit of a tough love slide. What we hear about giving when people say at church, and they use the word tithe, but tithe is 10% of income. And we're not saying that that is necessarily the upper or the lower limit to generosity. But when people say we tithe, and what they're actually saying is this conversation is done. And when you look at the numbers, if someone is giving $20 a week, bless them, because that's $1,000 a year. But if that's a tithe, then they're making $10,000 a year, which means that you should have a bus stop near your church, because no one can afford to drive to your church. And I mean, some people can afford to drive to church, but if your parking lot is full of vehicles, then it's quite likely that $1,000 a year isn't really a tithe. And I think what can happen is that at some point in your spiritual life, in your time spent with the church, that $20 a week was a thing. And it was, you put that $20 bill into an envelope, and that was a meaningful contribution that's been sort of frozen in time. So if people are on a guaranteed income, then they should have an excellent idea of how much they're able to give. I swiped that from Susan Graham Walker, who talks about guaranteed income instead of fixed income, to focus more on the stability of it. I realize that lots of things in life are stable, but that doesn't mean that we want to fix our giving at some point in the past. And I think that's a danger, maybe a little bit of nostalgia mixed in with kind of forgetfulness. So generosity is not a once and done thing. It is an active and dynamic and growing aspect of our spiritual life. And I see Karen nodding, which is wonderful. Okay, so look at the parking lot. I also want to look at the numbers. So I'm a bit of a data geek. I'm a lot of a data geek. Statistics Canada keeps track of when people claim the charitable receipts on their income tax, how many people do that. And it turns out, in fact, that of people who file their taxes, that 82% do not have any charitable receipts when they file their taxes. And you could say, oh, well, some people are pooling their giving with their spouse, but however you look at it, it is not a lot of people. There's this blue slice of the pie here, which is the 13% of tax filers who gave less than $1,000 a year. And the orange slice is the 5% of Canadian tax filers who donated $1,000 or more. And at this point, I've talked to so many generous Canadians that I feel I've met most of these people. I mean, I haven't, but it is a small slice of the pie of these really generous people. And I want to show you another slide because it relates to this one.
And I think it's something to
This
note.
is the percentage of the Canadian population who regularly attend a place of worship, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, but people who tend worship at least monthly is 15% of the Canadian population. And if you will see in the previous slide, those two slices of the pie look very similar. And that's because by and large, These are the same people. It's our people who attend worship regularly who are the most generous. And these people also tend to be older. So it is a shrinking segment of the population who does most of the charitable giving in Canada, to churches, to religious causes, to everything. It's a small slice of the population. And it's important for you to know that, not because I want you to be a stats expert, although that would be fun, but to realize that that we can't go back, that this is how things are now, and we can be a bit sad, but really what we need to do is figure out, how do we serve God faithfully within the now, and looking forward to how we can be a good neighbor now in 2023, and not looking back to how can we get the church back to 1955, because that's not our job.
Lori, somebody
So
just
here's
commented.
2 common strategies, friends, and Karen will have heard these strategies. I've heard these strategies lots of times. Lots of churches have these 2 strategies. The first one is silence. Let's pretend that this is not happening. This is a very common strategy. It is not an effective strategy, but it is very common. Let us just be quiet. Let us talk about our tulips. Let us talk about something else. By the way, my tulips are great. This one is a river in Egypt, the Nile, denial. That is another really common strategy. It goes together with the first one. So those are 2 really common strategies. Neither of them are great. So friends, we can do this. We can do this. We can talk about our discipleship and about our money. And angels always say, don't be afraid. They said this at Easter. They say this at Christmas. And I think they're still saying it to us now. Don't be afraid. The truth is that we serve a grace-filled God whose mercies are new every morning, who provides enough to share. And there's, oh man, we could talk about scripture texts and sing songs about this all day long. That would be a good webinar, actually. So what I want to do is explore this generosity, our generous God. And the model I want to use, if you've seen a webinar that I've done with before, is the Circle of Grace model. It's in my book, Growing a Generous Church, A Year in the Life of Peach Blossom Church. And in my book, it has a peach. For the webinar, I'm going to use something that works a little bit better on the screen. It's a pretty simple model. We've got God at the top. We've got people who are the recipients of God's grace, God's generosity, salvation, spring. I could go on. And we get to share with other people. We are the givers and the receivers. And then we respond with praise and thanksgiving to God. What often happens, though, when we start talking about money, like the hymns we sing are all solidly centered on God and God's mercies to us. But when it gets to finances, we can get a little strange and forget that that everything isn't a gift. We're very prone as humans to thinking that everything is mine. It's all me. It's my money. What's the church is trying to take my money, as if, but not I get to share what God has given me, but my money. There's a really big difference when we start framing it or phrasing it that way. So if the church does that and we think it's mine, it's our money, the church's money, then when we don't have the money that we would like to have, we're also, the flip side of self-sufficiency is despair. And I'm just going to say that again because it's a new learning for me. But the flip side of self-sufficiency is despair, because, hey, our church was going along tickety-boo and now it's not. And what did we do wrong? And maybe, just maybe, the shame and the guilt isn't ours to claim, because what we receive from God, we didn't earn. And in this situation, it's not a blame game either. So the more we can stay connected to our God, the better. We are not in this alone, friends. Another part of the circle of grace that gets neglected is the thank you. And if you've seen a webinar of mine before, you'll know that I'm exceedingly passionate about saying thank you. While I'm on this earth, I would really like churches to send out thank you letters with their annual receipts. Check my blog. That's my most popular post, is how to say thank you. Um, so if there's nothing else that you take from this webinar, can I give you a few words? I thank God for your generosity. Use those words often. Put them in the bulletin. Use them at church. Put them in the letters. I thank God for your generosity. Let's not leave God out of the loop. Oh, I'm going to skip this slide and talk about the budget. So I hope, even though I'm talking fast, that you realize that generosity is sharing the good things that God has given us and receiving from other people the good things God has given them, sharing and rejoicing in God's gifts. When we take God out of that equation, out of that circle, and just make it about people giving to the budget, we just whoosh, all the joy in life is drained out of generosity and it becomes a budget problem. And in a deficit situation, we're terribly prone to really focusing on the budget. And it's not about people anymore. It's not about who are our neighbors anymore. In fact, we might start cutting the love your neighbor items out of our budget. And then, oh my, and we can really get ourselves down, we're circling the drain of scarcity really quickly. So how we talk about this and how we think about it really matters, because if we are sharing what God has given us, there's always enough to share. It might not look like it did in the past. It's going to look different maybe, but we always have something to share with our neighbors. And how do we do that? And I really encourage us to not lose sight of that really important discipleship call. Otherwise, we could just get into a dark place. Okay. Any questions? I know I've done this before, so it all made sense to me, but it might not have. So please, if you've got a question.
Okay, Lori, can you hear me okay?
Does that mean I should just keep trucking along?
Can you hear me, Lori? Lori, I think your volume has gone off.
My computer also has this really cute feature right now where it just randomly cuts off the sound.
So see if you can get me back.
Yeah, you're here.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, I do have a few comments from people. And one thing is that your sound cuts out every once in a while. And I notice when you lean back or if you turn your head. So when you're talking, just be sure that you lean forward like you are now.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm turning up the microphone. I'm moving in. Thank you.
There we go. Perfect. It was just like little bits, but it's just enough to, okay. So some of the comments people have are, here's one. Was back when you were showing the charts about how people are giving. So one comment is some people are not able to claim donations for tax as their taxable income is nil without the deduction.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with that too. I don't think though it changes the idea that some people aren't giving and there's a lot of people that don't give anything. And if we're going to actually talk about that, how you can actually look at this is coming up with your church numbers. So you don't have to look at the trends. But unfortunately, Lori and I have helped enough churches look at their own numbers to know that that holds true in most of our congregations. And if you ask your church treasurer, they'll probably would say, look at the numbers, you'd probably find that you've got a big chunk of people who aren't giving at all to the congregation, some who don't give very much, and some who are carrying the weight of the congregation's expenses with their gifts, and they're giving far often beyond 10%. And then people who are giving 10%. So we have the whole gamut there, but I think most of us in our churches, there are definitely people who are giving nothing, and then some who are giving what they were giving 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
So that's it. Somebody else had commented, many people donate, but not all is going to a church GoFundMe. They're going to GoFundMe campaigns, Christmas kettles, cancer and stuff. And so donations with no receipts. And yeah, I would agree with that as well. I've seen that there are donations with no receipts, but Canada Helps did a study not that long ago, and I wrote about it in 2 issues ago in the Connections, where they estimated the amount of gifts that came without receipts, small gifts like that. And it's not insignificant. There's quite a bit that are given that way, small gifts, but there's still a large chunk of people who aren't giving anything, even if you include those in. So you can look and see, Canada Helps, and I think Imagine Canada looked and also incorporated in people who don't get receipts.
Yes, people in surveys of generosity, people tend to exaggerate. The great thing about the tax filer data is that receipts don't exaggerate. So it's not perfect, but it is a really good measure of generosity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, some people call giving to the church tithing, even though they did not give according to the biblical tithe of 10%.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People may give 5%, 3%. When we talk about tithing and some of our material, we talk about making an intentional decision to give a proportion of your income. And that's kind of following the spirit of the tithe. And that may be 3%, 5%, 10%, 12%, 20%. But you sort of make an intentional decision to give a proportion of your income. And if you've never given before, it's a great way to suggest to people, look, and could you start with 1% of your income, start with 2%. And this is why we want to get people growing in generosity. But I'm going to be talking about that too in a few minutes. So these are great questions that are going to set up our next discussion, I think.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
All right, let me see. Oh, here we go. I would be interested to know, and this is all who had a planned budgeted deficit, did the year wind up ending in a deficit, or was the planned deficit miraculously covered? Oh, that was something I wanted to say at the beginning. Sometimes people plan a deficit and then the money comes in to meet it. So definitely that would be an interesting thing that we could look into. But definitely sometimes because you have a budgeted deficit doesn't mean that always the year ends up in a deficit. Yeah, at the same time, you can wonder, you could say, what does it say to people when we've got a planned deficit? You want to communicate about that. We're hoping for you to step up, but usually your numbers in your budget should be based on numbers from previous years. So we could say, oh, we've stepped up. But you could also then think, well, we're going to have different campaigns, so we're going to step up our ask. So we're going to actually anticipate or hope that the income is also going to be more for that year. Because if you're consistently passing a deficit budget, it's consistently saying to the church that either we don't know how to plan, we don't know how to budget, we can do this. You could still have a dream budget. You could pass a balanced budget and then say, this is what we'd like to do even more if you give any more, or this is our budget, but we've planned a budget with growth in the income, and we're hoping that you're going to grow your giving and that we're going to have new people coming, and there's different ways. So what do you think about that, Lori, like about planned deficits in a budget?
There's a stewardship consultant, Margaret, and I can't remember her last, Markison, who says that your vision has to be bigger than your budget. So I think it's important, essential maybe, that what would we do with $1 million? That's not just about a deficit question. It's also, to me, a planned giving question. Like, what would we do with a bequest in our church? And we can always fight about it later is not a terrific answer to that question. So if you can dream big and think, what would we do with a lot of funds? If someone was very generous, that helps for you to have a vision. It helps for planned giving. It helps for bequests. And just for, I don't want to call it the regular generosity, but the ordinary miracle of annual giving, it helps for that too.
So I would say, if you're doing a planned deficit, what's it communicating to people? And is it actually communicating what you want it to communicate for? And so I would tie this. I've got Deb who says, in our church, we ended 2022 with a planned deficit. However, we still had a surplus from previous years to cover it. So 2023 is the same. Well, you can have your bank balance. You could put the income in for 2022 so that people can see really clearly that that's where the income is coming from, if that's sort of your plan. So just when you're looking at your budgets and your financial statements, as long as everybody has the message and they're understanding that that's what's happening, then really you're not about a deficit budget. You're about spending the gifts, the surpluses that came in previous years. But you just have to say, I know from talking to people, as soon as they hear deficit, these little red flags go up. Little alarm bells are like, why are they doing this? And they're going to go in and question more. So if you're doing that intentionally, then show it the year end. Oh, but we're covering it here from our surpluses of 2022. And then you can see this is what we're actually going to finish the year end with. So it can be a good way to do it. Okay, I'm going to get moving in. We have a few more questions, but we're going to have more answers later. And so I'll make sure I'm going to pick up again at how do we teach faithful tithing or a percentage of the income. And we'll come to this discussion after we've moved on so that we don't go too long. Because it's a nice leading going into creating a culture of generosity. What can we do in our churches and congregations to help build this culture of generosity and to encourage giving? So I would say the first thing we have to do is be aware that language is so important and that what we say is important. As soon as we hear deficit, we hear scarcity language. We hear scarcity and it assumes that everyone is already giving what they can. And we've already seen the numbers show that it's not. Probably you can look at the numbers in your congregation. But you also have to know that you don't know all of the circumstances of people. Usually the annual budget is people giving gifts from their annual income. But then we have planned gifts. People may give from their savings. They may get an inheritance someday and want to give a tithe to that. There can be unexpected ways people have savings. So don't assume that you know everything. And I'll get into some case studies about what go more of that. And then scarcity also makes it feel like that the only thing we can do is we need to make cuts. It's time to make cuts. It's time for us to be more realistic. And we hear this more and more, particularly, after the pandemic. It's kind of surprising. Churches came through the pandemic surprisingly strong. A lot of them were surprised that their regular givers kept giving and found different ways to make sure that their offerings got there. People pivoted quickly. We had digital giving in that. But also the wage subsidies that came from the government really helped congregations to get through that rough period. But now we're in the post-pandemic period and it's not unexpected. So if it's happening in your church, don't be surprised. But attendance is down about 40% overall from congregations, people not coming back. There's some, yes, who are participating online, but they're not coming back in the same way. And then some who are coming back aren't coming back as regularly. And there's different ways that they may stabilize and continue to give the same amount that they're giving, but it's important to know that our churches just aren't as full anymore. So this makes us feel afraid. It picks on feelings of fear and scare, that we're scared. We can't see the future. We don't see growth. We don't see the good news as much. So it can distract us because we know, and we'll go to the next slide, that actually the Bible, the scriptures, God, it's all of the stories are about abundance. And I can pick out a few. I'd love to, I think we've talked about this at different times. We could just do a whole seminar and whole study on abundance, illustrations and examples in the Bible. We've got the 5,000 people who are fed with just a few fish and loaves. And then not only that, but they gather up the leftovers and are able to continue to feed people from the leftovers. So that's incredible. In the Bible, we're filled with stories of the water turning into wine. We've got the parables of the mustard seed and the yolk and the yeast, where little small things grow into something that are abundant, like unexpectedly abundant, bigger than we can even imagine. And great illustrations there. So our God is a God of abundance, who has given enough, and we have enough, not even just enough for ourselves, but enough to share. And I think that's really important. We have to remember that this needs to be part of our vision and part of our mission and about who we are as a church. So yeah. I've been reading a great book, and you'll get the title at the end. We suggest some resources called Abundance, Creating a Culture of Generosity by Michael Ward. Published in 2020. And he says, I believe that abundance is a mindset and not a condition of wealth. Abundance is recognizing that the one who provides us with everything and recognizing that it is not only enough, but enough to share. And I would totally say that I've seen this in talking with people. I've met wealthy people who feel that there isn't enough, wealthy people who are in loads of debt and, just are scared of the future. And I've met people who are live very simple and very plain lives and who are always giving out of everything they have, and the amount that they have enough. And I look how simple, and I know that are working very minimum wage or just a little bit above jobs, and yet you would never know it when you met them because they have enough and it flows out of them. So that's so abundance. We want to be sure we were changing our viewpoint, even if you're in a deficit, from scarcity to abundance. So how do we do this? How do we begin to trust God while still being responsible stewards of the resources and making sure that we're giving people accurate information? And Lori and I were saying, we could have, we probably should do a whole series on this. We've got enough material to cover a number of sessions, and we're going to try and pack everything into 75 minutes. So we're just going to spark some ideas for you, I hope, today, and then we'll continue to provide you resources to help this. So, but generosity, it's also important, if we're trying to build a culture of generosity, that we understand what generosity is. And the generous ones are ones who have learned that the joy of material wealth is the ability to share it with others for the common good. And I love this one, with no expectation of receiving anything in return. And that was the amazing thing when I was working for PWS&D and Relief and Development and in any mission work there, is that you see people giving again and again and again with no expectation of return, and it just flows out of them. And that's where you can see God alive. That's where I know that I've definitely experienced that. So the truth is that giving is it is a joyful endeavor. I think it's important to know that giving sparks joy, and it builds joy, and it's also something to say that we should also be joyful when we give. And when I was working in relief and development, and I've seen it in the church as well, and I've seen it between people know when you're a reluctant giver. They know if you're giving begrudgingly. They know if you're like, oh, this is an obligation, I don't really want to give it to you, but here, take it. And they know when you're a joyful giver, when it's being given out of love, out of compassion, and why. And that's where we keep saying that giving and all of this is a spiritual discipline, because we want the gifts of the Spirit to flow through your giving. Love, compassion, kindness, joy. This is what it's all about. And of course, my favorite scripture, it's like, that's how we are taught to give. God loves a joyful giver. So some of the questions we're asking, well, should a tithe be on net tax or gross tax? Should tithe be 10%, 3%, 5%? When I get asked these questions, and they're always interesting and nice debate, but I'm like, you're missing the point of the story. The point of the story is what's going to give you joy. So you decide for yourself. I want to give a proportion of my income. You decide, is it going to be your gross or your net? And then you decide, is it going to be 3%? Well, that's what I can afford to give today. Can I give 5? Can I give 10? What can I afford to give out of what I've been giving? What's going to spark joy in me? Sometimes I've heard we should give until it hurts. And I read somewhere that no, we should actually give when it makes us feel good. And that's what I like to think when I hear this scripture. And then the next one I wanted to say. Oh yeah, so giving is very much a spiritual practice. It's part of our spirituality. It's who we are. We serve a God who gave everything, gave his very life for the whole world. And I wanted to throw this in because I will often talk about this and get very excited about giving and what we can give. It's not about being wealthy. It's not about being poor. Because, and I love this scripture, that if the eagerness is there, if the joy is there, the heart is in the right place, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. So you are enough. It's enough. So this is the gift for us. Okay. Yeah. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who will help you dig in a little bit more into what's our story.
Thanks, Karen. I totally agree with Karen. Like, we need a week. Thank you for the recognition that God loves a hilarious giver and that we are enough. And I do want to remind us all, like, the deficit might make us feel that somehow we're not enough, and we're not, but our God is sufficient and we are enough. This is a quote from Dr. Gordon Livingston. Nostalgia is the thief of hope. It tricks people into believing that their best days are behind them. And that's not true. So I want us to encourage, to look forward, to know that God always has more in store for us, and we are enough. So we don't need to try to look back and think, oh, only if we could get the church to be like it was. Let's look forward and see where God is taking us. I have a series of polls for you now, just to think about some of the practices. These aren't intended to make you feel bad, but we're curious. Are you intentional about gratitude at your church? Do you include letters with annual receipts? It's looking to me like this one's not working. Is it working? Are you able to answer this one?
Let me see.
I don't know. Technology is not always our friend, but you can go ahead and type it into the chat. Do you send letters with your annual receipts? You just doesn't have, grammar doesn't count here. Spelling doesn't count. Just like, yes, we send letters. No, not yet. Be curious about that. That's an easy starting place for your gratitude. It doesn't look like the poll is working, but go ahead and type that one in.
Yeah, I think the poll said it was all.
And do you tell stories? Do you tell stories in your bulletin, in your newsletter, on your website? Grateful stories of generosity, of how your church is a contributor to the Presbyterians sharing, and that's helping. That's helping your money follow your prayers, because you're praying for churches in other places and you're praying for leadership in seminaries. And when you give, your money is following your prayers. So there's so many wonderful stories that could be told. And the same thing about testimonials and sharing in the worship service. Faithful saints that have been supporting your church for decades, how did they learn to be generous? Why do they care about the church? Those testimonials are the best stewardship sermon going. So I really encourage you to tell these stories. I've heard a bunch of them in my book. It never gets old. So can we increase giving? I wish I could say a definitive yes or a definitive no, but it's really hard for me to answer that question in the abstract. I think the answer is probably yes, but one way to find out is something that Karen has been talking about earlier, is a generosity assessment. It's a joyful look at the numbers in your church. It's based in gratitude. So the most important thing we'll find out is what people are grateful for in your church and what stories you can tell and how you're giving. So it's not just numbers, it's based in gratitude. And I would encourage you to check out this link. There's quite a lot of information there about a generosity assessment. I wrote an article recently actually about this, and I just got a wonderful testimonial from someone who had done this program a couple of years ago, and she remembered, and they had learned something. It had made a difference in their church, and I was really pleased. So this is something that can help. It's helpful to have someone who's half a step outside of your church remind you why people care about your church and how much people are giving. Now, this picture is meant to illustrate a particular Bible story, and that is Luke 11. And this does relate to giving quite a bit. It's the man who knocks on his neighbor's door at midnight asking for 3 loaves of bread because he has a visiting friend. And I could and have done an entire webinar just on this text. But what I want to remind you is, again, about the budget a budget is not a goal in and of itself. It's, what do you need those 3 loaves of bread for? Who are you feeding with those 3 loaves of bread? What's your ministry story? It's so important to know that and not just fixate on, oh, we need a budget. So again, that's a whole webinar, but just to remind you that you need to know what it is why you're asking and who you're asking, and that makes it easier. And I'll say it again, who is my neighbor? The point is not a budget so much, but why are we doing this? How are we caring for our community? What has God given that we can share? And as Karen has already said, there's enough to do this. It might not look like it's done in the past, but there's enough. Maybe you know someone who always brings casseroles. I do, who has brought probably hundreds or maybe thousands of casseroles throughout the year. And I think when I think of something like you can always afford to be generous, I think, has this person ever run out of tuna or macaroni? And someone said, oh, I wish they would because I don't like tuna, but that's a different question. But you can always afford to be generous in some way. And it's quite an ongoing miracle how that works. And Karen has some examples of churches that have done just that. And I'm going to pass it over to her.
Okay, so I'll just go back to a question that was earlier, and that was a question when we were talking about the tithing. And the one book that I've been reading about creating a culture of generosity in your church really encourages churches to get away from the discussion of tithing, because it can make people feel like, oh, I can't do that, or it's very specific with a number, 10%. But they talk about, teach proportional giving, get people started. Especially, let's think about all those people who are giving in the congregation. What can we do to get people started? And so I think this is actually a goal, and a realistic goal for your stewardship committee or your church, your session, is that what we want to see in the next year is having every member growing in generosity this year. And it's kind of like what you have. Well, we want to see everybody growing their spiritual gifts this year. We want to see us growing in prayer. We want to see us growing in discipleship, in faithfulness. So here we want to see that every member is growing somehow in their generosities from wherever they are, whether they're giving 10% or 20%, or they're not giving anything. Let's take that first step. And so, well, how can we do this? Go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm going to use share a few stories of different strategies that different congregations have used to grow generosity in their church, and to help deal with churches when they've had a vision for something to do. So this is a story that some of you may have heard before. It's Bethel Church in Nova Scotia. We've often used it as an example in our planned giving, but it's a brilliant one, so I'm going to use it again. And they were a congregation that had lots of kids. It didn't hurt that at the time the minister had triplets, and that helped to fill the Sunday school. But they had lots of kids coming, and they didn't have a plan or a way to sort of deal and do Christian education with them. They had a very small endowment fund that was like around $5,000, and so was providing, about $50 maybe to the congregation every year, buy a few supplies, but it wasn't very much, not very much. So they had lots of kids, no money. They were, rural congregations struggling the way that many rural congregations do. Well, what they did though was that they had a dream. And the dream was that they wanted to hire somebody who could help have programs for these children midweek, and have a strong Sunday school and a good youth program to help serve the kids in their community. So they began by sharing the vision. This is our dream. We want to hire a Christian educator. It was very specific goal of what they wanted to do over and above what they were already doing. So they began by, they educated the congregation. They educated about planned gifts and the impact they could do. They particularly educated about giving gifts of securities and the financial benefits of that. And they educated about leaving bequests. So those were the two main areas that they did. And those, in fact, are the two areas, the largest that we see with congregations of planned gifts. Gifts of securities, which may be from an estate or may be given when you're alive, and giving a bequest. And they were completely surprised and shocked, because if they looked around the congregation, they would not have thought this before they started the campaign. But they were able to raise $100,000 in 3 months. The community, the church, grabbed hold of this vision. They saw it and they thought it was wonderful. And even $70,000 came in from 3 gifts of stock alone. And they wouldn't have said, oh, we've got people in our congregation who can give that type of gift. So you never know what's out there. With that, they were then continued to do the fundraising till they had $150,000, which was the minimum they needed to invest in the PCC's consolidated fund. And then they began to take the income off of that money so that they could launch a midweek program, hire a Christian educator, and launch a midweek program for children in the community. I know I've talked since then, it's been over 200,000 that's been raised and given there. So that definitely, that fund now helps them every year to be able to support the Christian educator worker, which helps them increase the budget and money that they have to spend. And so what are the lessons that we've learned from this one? Well, first of all, we know that people give to people. So it wasn't about, oh, we need the income to pay somebody. We need the income to pay a salary. It's about, here are the kids. This is what we want to do with the kids. This is who you're giving to. And they got the children involved in the campaign and writing thank you notes and bringing the offerings forward during the church service and all of that. So they understood this important idea that people give to people. And we saw that in the circle of grace that Lori shared with us. The other thing that they did was that money follows mission. And if any of you had been to Stewards by Design, which was a conference we ran for many years, Dr. Kelly Callahan said this all the time, that money follows mission, and we see it again and again. You need to be able to articulate what the mission is and the ministry. People don't want to give to a budget. They want to give to participate in God's mission. So you need to be able to take your budget and articulate in how it is fitting and following God's mission. And we have a lot on our website about a narrative budget, which will tell you how to change your discussions from how much are the electrical bills, the salary, the pension payments, to how much are we paying, are we investing in worship, in Christian education, in caring for the vulnerable. And you can use a narrative budget to do that. It changes the dialogue completely, and it's great for when you're talking to people. And then they taught people how they can give and what they can give and why they should give. So that was one of the examples. Another example that I want to share with you comes from First Church Brandon. So we'll just go across the country a little bit. Doesn't only work in the Maritimes. But they had an endowment fund then, which was called a slush fund or a rainy day fund. And I think I've heard and been in many congregations who have this. And for me, it's an interesting idea, because you know what it really says is that we're waiting for disaster to happen. We know what's going to happen, and we're holding on to it until it comes. That rainy day is coming. Because what I liked is that Brandon was like, yeah, it wasn't working for them. Gifts weren't being left. The slush fund wasn't growing the way it might be. But when they changed it and began to call it their partner in ministry fund, and they changed the terms so that the income matched gifts in order to expand or launch new ministries, they stopped waiting for the roof to fall in, for it starting to rain, and started to look to the future. And it became about ministry and mission and how do we move forward. And there is a future for this church. And we're going to be there to partner with the people who are able to do this mission together. And it was sort of taking the gifts of the past and marrying them with the gifts current to plan ministry for the future. So I loved it. And during their foundation month, they told the stories of people who made the gifts, and they were thankful and grateful for that. So they shared the stories and the impact. So out of this, some lessons that you can take are: be grateful. Be sure that you are saying thank you. I totally agree with Lori when she said that. Express thanks. Be grateful to God and be grateful to the people who have participated in this mission and who have captured the vision. So say thank you. And also, and share the stories. Share the stories of what the gifts are doing, about the people. Share the stories about the people who are giving the gifts, and just share, communicate. And I've got one last example. And so we have St. Andrew's Kingston, and there they had an endowment fund. They created an endowment fund to cover the maintenance and upkeep of the building, so that all gifts go through the offering plate go to support ministry. And I think this is a creative one. I've heard different people say whether they like it or not. What I like about it for Presbyterian congregations or for small congregations with older historic buildings is that we know our congregations are tending to be smaller, and the expense of carrying a heavy historic building is very expensive. And so this is a way that you can build up a fund, and you'll find that people are interested in that, who they're very tied to the church. Maybe they were married in the church, their grandparents were buried there. They're just, it's part of their family and community, very important, and they want to see it continue into the future. So they'll give to an endowment fund, and then you really get to engage people in mission as they're giving. And so it takes the edge off, particularly. It can take the edge off of a budget and help the church continue with an even smaller congregation. All right. But lessons from that is that be sure to tailor the funds to allow you to do ministry. And I like that one because it allows to do ministry. It's not just about supporting the building and keeping the building there. It's about keeping the building so that people can really focus to do ministry. And that's important. If it's only about paying the light bills, it's not going to work. But if it's about, freeing up money so that the current congregation can focus on mission, then people get excited about it. And you can use your endowments to support future ministry. And I'm not saying every congregation needs an endowment. I'm just saying this is some of the ways that some congregations have found to take the edge off of pressure, off of their operating budgets, to do this through their planned gifts. But all of these lessons, they also apply to just your annual gifts. If you sort of know what you're asking for, know where it's going to go, share the stories about people, share the impacts of the gifts. This is all going to help increase generosity in your congregations. And the fact is that ministry costs. It's important for us to know that we're involved in the community. There's definitely costs, and that just press the next. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's important to know that ministry costs. I had revised that slide, the last thing. And there are three main costs for ministries. Our congregations, we see the church buildings, we see personnel, and we see programs. So when it comes to thinking about costs and whether they're going to be cut, whether they're going to be cut, or I would rather us look at how can we make sure that we're having most efficient use of our buildings, of our personnel, and our programs. And so these are a few questions. I'll get you actually to go back, Lori, to the buildings one, and then just a few questions you can keep in mind. And I'm going to go over this because I really want us, we have this scheduled to 3:15, and I want to be sure there's lots of time for us to have conversations. So we're really quite close to the end. But are your church buildings, how are they being used? Who else might use them, and what are they being for? If it's only being used on Sunday for worship, I was talking with one congregation, they're like, I don't, also this building, it's just so underutilized. I don't actually feel that comfortable giving too much to the church when it's only for Sunday worship. But if it's, full of life and lots of people going and it's being maximized throughout the week, look at your building and say, how is it being used? Who else might use it, and what might it be used for? Ensure that whatever it's being used for, it's helping to build your congregation's ministry. So whether it's rental or groups coming in to use it for free, it's building the profile in the church, it's serving your community in some ways. If you're renting it, be sure that the renting is going to support missionary and going to support ministry. Find out what serves the community, how it could connect, and how community members might need it. And then when you're considering, you may consider, okay, are we allowing people to rent it, or are they by donation? And this can be tailored. You may rent it to some groups that it's like, if you've got a Montessori school, it's part of the school. Rent is sort of what they're expecting to pay. They're taking an impact. That's fine. They're charging for kids to come. But you might have like a group like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or a group that's serving vulnerable people, or the food bank, that you allow them to come and use the building even for free or by donation. And I'm often, you're often going to be surprised that groups like that, the donations will be larger than they would ever pay in rent. You've got somebody who's grateful for the use of the building, donations will come in. One of the churches I went to, they are right next to a nursing home, and they said, people can use our building for free for funerals. And we're not going to charge, this is part of our service to the community, they can for free. And then, every once in a while it'll be like, oh, we're doing this, should we be doing it? Well, here's the cost of the church and all of that. And then a donation would come in, and it would be more than all of the funerals, from one person and all of the funerals. And I would sort of see this because I was on the audit committee, but they wouldn't always see it. So be thankful and grateful, and kind of share that excitement also. Oh, we've received a gift from somebody. It doesn't have to be identified. Somebody was grateful to use our church to have the funeral, and this was a gift that they've given us to do future mission and ministry. Doesn't need to identify anyone. Okay, so rent versus donation. We are having an upcoming webinar in June 2023. We're just working on finalizing the date. That's going to dive really deep into buildings and look at all the different ways you can use it. It's going to be with a case study, so from practical experience. Then as you're coming to ask personnel and church personnel, again, you can look at, if you're doing evaluations, how are they contributing to the ministry? How do skills, if you've got a team, you can think about church personnel, both volunteers and staff who are doing this. How do their skills complement each other? How do they build upon one another? How effectively do they work as a team? Because I hear a lot of the time too, oh, we've got a deficit, it's time to go to a part-time minister. Well, is that, the first, sort of instinct of what we have to do, or can we afford full-time? Well, sometimes that may be part of the solution, especially if you look at the skills of volunteers around you. But then in other ways, you might say, well, how can we also have a minister or someone we pay who is helping bring people in, or taking the church out, or, helping us fulfill our mission? Because that's why people are giving to the church, right? They want to participate in God's mission. So what do we need for leadership in order to help us do that? And be sure you're realistic about that. All right, so you can ask these questions. It's about how can they be effective, as opposed to, oh, let's just cut back. And then when it comes to church programs, again, look at who are they serving? What might we do differently? Don't be scared to ask that, to let go of things sometimes, to try something new. And what does our community need? So these are sort of just a few of the questions as you're looking at your expenses and you're looking at that and say, maybe we actually need to we need to invest in certain areas or try something new, to reach out to the community, to bring people in, to be brave and to take risks. Yeah, so we can do that. And then I think the next slide. Okay, so what I'm encouraging mostly is that when you're looking at the expenses side, you want to be sure that you're using your gifts for maximum impact. And because you want to be able to articulate that as well. And that'll come through in your narrative budget if you're talking about that, as you're sharing and encouraging people to give. It's like, we've got this dynamic minister who does this and is going out. We've got a church building that is serving our community, and you can see all the different ways and things that it is doing. We've got these programs that are alive and exciting, and they serve needs, and we can tie it to the Bible, like it's participating in God's mission and ministry. If you're able to do that, people are going to give, and people are going to want to give. So don't do your church programs just because it's always been done, but do it because it's effective. Invest in programs and work that proclaim the good news of the gospel, and it can be in word and action. Look at programs or how your church is meeting community needs, and then use your volunteers wisely. There's different ways. You could do a whole webinar on doing mapping the assets of your church and saying, where can we do, what skills do we have? Don't try and do everything. Look at the skills in your church and just say, this is our mission and this is our ministry, and we're going to really focus on it and do it. And then the most important one, I should have put at the top, is have fun. I had a whole team with me working with Dr. Callahan on Stewards by Design, and it became our little mantra. Are we having fun? Because if people are having fun with the mission and ministry, they are going to give in more ways than one. And the gifts that are being given will be multiplied. It's all that joy stuff that's in there as well. So just be sure, check in, sometimes if it's like this, we're doing a fundraising bake sale and it is draining us. It is taking so much of our energy and so time, and we're tired of baking and we don't have the resources anymore to do this. We're not having fun anymore. Then don't do that. Like, you probably will actually do better to ask people to give donations so they don't have to do the bake sale anymore, and have fun with that. Silent auction, we don't do the bake sale. But yeah, have fun. Okay, so all right, and just remember, there is hope, there is good news, there's angels. By the power at work within us, God can accomplish abundantly more than all we can ask for or imagine. And I've seen that again and again. It was a lesson I learned very early on working for PWS&D in the church, and just seeing how people respond to disasters and working with people in poverty, and that again and again, God works through our gifts. So Lori told me that my webinar was going too long beforehand, and we want to make sure there's time for conversation. So we'll just let you know quickly a few resources that are available, and then we're going to discuss, and we're available to just discuss until we've answered your questions. So the resources that may help, Lori, I'll let you introduce yours.
Sure. My website I've been blogging for a long time. So there's actually a lot of really short articles on how to say thank you at church and how to think about money and talk about wills. I'd be happy to Zoom in or visit your boardroom, your board meeting. I can help talk both faith and fundraising at the same time. So that's something that Jesus talks about money. We can too. That's my superpower. I've mentioned my blog where you can look at the numbers and also learn about the spiritual discipline of giving. So if you want to go on, hop on there, you can sign up and that would be lovely. And a lot of the stories that I've heard that people have shared with me are in my book. It's the only theology book that I know of that has a picture of a man snowblowing the church in February, praising God that no one has fallen in the parking lot and broken a hip. So it's got study questions. It's meant to be very accessible. So I'd encourage you to check that one out, either on my website or on Amazon. And here is a lovely slide about the people at Presbyterian. The PCC, they are not a black hole, friends. They are people who care deeply about the church. Email them, get them to come to your church, get them to Zoom. They are good people doing God's work. And that really should be Karen's slide, but I thought it might be easier to hear it from me.
Yes, that's great. And there's myself, but also Maggie has done workshops about planned gifts for congregations, and Jim is also very happy to come talk to your sessions, your congregations, however we can serve. The PCC website is available, lots of good stuff, tidbits about narrative budgets, thank you letters, just church services, worship lectionary stuff that you can use as well. All right, and then a few books that I found particularly helpful are these, which you can find. So Abundance, Creating a Culture of Generosity by Michael Ward. Between the Listening and the Telling, How Stories Can Save Us. This is just about helping tell the stories and find the stories that are in your congregations and that you want to share. As well as one that is great for treasurers is this one, Church Finances for Missional Leaders, because Bonnie Martin, and I know her and work with her, she really dives into what does a budget mean? What does an audit mean? What does it mean to be balanced? And she goes into all these details of all the things that you do as treasurers and connects it to mission. And so it really helps, particularly I think if you're a treasurer, see how your work is mission.
Mm-hmm.
And then Gracious Stewardship, Developing the Church in the Way of Jesus. Lots of good illustrations in there, particularly if you're doing some preaching. The first book, Creating a Culture of Generosity, and this Gracious Stewardship, lots of resources for preaching resources. Okay, so this takes us, I think, to our discussion time. And we are going to go through the chat, and we've got 4 minutes, but we'll stay on longer. And just a reminder again, the recording will be shared. Okay, let's go. Jim, do you have any things that you want to share or start with the chat?
Yes. Yeah, let me just take a look here. Hold on. I was looking up URLs, everybody. Yeah, so some of the folks have asked, well, one person asked about is tithing on gross or net income? And Murley jumped in and said that there was a quote from a former pastor who said, do you want a gross blessing or a net blessing? And I thought that was pretty funny. So a couple of other questions here. We have Margaret asks, for whatever reason, our congregation is very reluctant to challenge its membership to give more. They feel it's unseemly. As a professional fundraiser myself, I know the biggest reason people don't give or don't increase their giving is because they've never been asked. How do we change this mindset?
I think I can jump in with a little bit, and some of it, you could start with a Bible study. You could start with a study looking into that. And I say Laurie's book is a great one to use. There's also a really short book by Henry Nouwen that is The Spirituality of Fundraising. And it's just, great. So get the session. But it's often the leaders who are reluctant to ask and who feel like they're already asking so much of the congregation. But they need to see that this is really part of the mission and ministry, that you're not asking to give to us. We're not asking to give to pay a pastor's salary. We're asking you to give and participate in mission and ministry. And so it's really an invitation, and to take hold of some of those. It's an invitation to joy. It's an invitation to receive the blessings that come when you give of your resources. So I think if you sort of look at it like that, it is a little different from the fundraising attitude. We're not trying to be better than the others. Like, we're not trying to up my bid. So we're not sort of looking at how much are you giving or how much are you giving. You're looking at what have I been given and how can I give out of the resources? So you need to sort of, look at that. And it's also not about giving to the budget as much as it's giving what has you been given and how can you give. That's not to say the budget isn't important, because that question comes up, well, I don't have to give to the church. You can give in many different places today. There's lots of Christian organizations you can give to. There's lots of different ways that you can give. So the congregation wants to be sure that it's got clarity and transparency as it's presenting its budget and as it's reporting on the finances and on the gifts that are given, because people want to know, if I give to the congregation, if I make this big decision, okay, yes, God has called me to give, it's a spiritual discipline, I'm going to give 10%. They may say, okay, and I'll give 5% to the congregation. I want to feel like that's going to do something, it's going to have an impact. And if the church is empty all week and it's just there for the worship service, is that really the best use of 5% of my income to go there? If there's lots of things going on, there's life and vision, then I'll feel, oh yeah, I want to get, like, this is, I'm going to give, and I'm going to see if I can grow it every year. So it's, you got to change the mind of the leadership, and you've got to get them out of the sort of scarcity and the fear. And sometimes it means that they have to start talking about money themselves, even start with the questions, well, who taught you to give? Why do you give to the church? Why is it important? And I think that's important to, Lori talked about the generosity assessment. There's 2 parts in the generosity assessment. One is look at your numbers, and not people, just numbers. Who's giving, how many people, what are they giving? Looks at the statistics, so you get a picture of that. And then it does a survey to ask, what are you grateful for this church for? And some of you may be surprised at what comes out of that survey, because it does help people to go, oh yeah, this is why we're asking people to give. They are grateful. They see the good things our church is doing. So, yeah.
That's definitely the best part, is that the stories of gratitude. Gratitude is the gateway drug to generosity.
Well, there's, just as a preview to Reverend Kirk Summers' upcoming webinar with us in June, one thing Kirk says is that in lieu of doing a narrative budget for Trinity York Mills, what he does is he, during the annual general meeting, when they're going through the annual, the report, end of year report, he likes to keep it future focused and mission focused, so that the whole time he's talking about what they're doing, it's not about the nuts and bolts of running a church, but about what that church is achieving with that money. And he really tries to make that. I've been there for that annual report, so I know that's true. That's how he does it. I think it's a smart way to think about it.
Jim, I'll just, so I've got, the next question was Deb, or comment. The problem with using surplus over deficits is that we cannot get the congregation to understand that the surplus will be gone in a short period of time unless givings increase. So I think it is important when I talked about if you're having a continual deficit as well. And if you're like, oh, well, we can cover this deficit. We've got funds that may allow us to do mission or ministry for the next 5 years. We could have this pattern for the next 5 years. And I've heard this in congregations, but in 5 years, we're going to be in trouble. So it's good for the session to be aware of this and to be strategic. Oh, if you're going to start using reserves, then, and you're going to do it over 5 years, what steps are you going to take to say, oh, this is how we're going to help grow generosity in our congregation? And it might be grow generosity in our congregation and also get new people into the congregation, because at some point you still need to have enough people coming to our congregation. And sometimes I do hear from congregations, and I feel it, and like my heart breaks, and I do wonder, some of our small congregations, first of all, I'm almost always amazed at how we've got these small congregations and the generosity in that congregation, because they are there, they're of the congregation, they're supporting mission and ministry, and things are going well, but they keep getting smaller. So at some point you may need to talk about amalgamation or dissolution. That may come at some point if you've got continual deficits, if your reserves are going down. But the idea here is that before you get to that stage, if you've implemented everything and you're doing everything that we've talked about today, then look at the legacy and say, what's the legacy we want this congregation to leave? And look forward, even as you plan to make that type of changes. The church is still going to be here. The congregations may amalgamate. Some may not be here in the future, but I would like to see all of our congregations looking forward and moving forward, even to the future, even if we end up having less congregations in the church in the end, and say, well, we went out, but we went out strong, and we went out leaving an impact and talking about what's the legacy they want to leave in their community. All right, Jim, and let's see, where are we now?
Well, Glenn Sampson in New Brunswick had some observations, one of which is really about the importance of communicating, the importance of budget and updating the congregation. But and subsequent to that, he mentioned that that his church, Knox St. Luke's, has a ministry that helps with food security, and even people outside of the church are donating to that. And that it's adding that the basically mission follows ministry in such a way that you even end up raising money from people who aren't even in your pews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. There are many different, we've covered that in some of our webinars, and that could be a whole different one too, of how you can ask your community and people who use the church building too may want to, don't be scared to ask them. But one thing is to be important is that when you do the asking, you don't want the asking to be, oh, we're behind in our budget, so can you please give? That is not an encouraging way to ask. Or, we're in crisis, can you give? We need you to give $5 more a month. If everyone did, can we do that? Instead, it would be good to change the language and say, this is thank you for your gifts. Even when there's a deficit budget, people have given to the church, and they've given faithfully, and they've given with the whole heart, and they want to see it to participate in God's mission. So thank you for your gifts. We are so grateful that you have given. There is, more that we want to do. There is, this, and sort of present to them that this is where we're at. So it's great. Communicate with the congregation, but be grateful and thank you. So this is how much is given. This is how much our expenses were. And people can see it from, they can see where it's going.
Yeah. Dennis brought up the Pareto principle, the idea that 80% of donations come from 20% of givers. And I was just thinking about the importance of micro habits. And one of the things that you can bring up with your congregation is the idea that it doesn't have to be a lot of money, or if you find that you're not giving anything right now, make it an incredibly small amount, so much you would never notice, and just get in the habit of giving, because as we've mentioned many times before, that as Jesus said, the money, your heart follows your money, not the other way around. So if you're giving, your heart's going to follow that gift. And so even if it's a small gift, that's still going to be meaningful, and it will help create habits.
Great. We have some great comments here. I have Bruce, who said that the budget is a plan for ministry and mission, nothing more, nothing less. And I really like that one. It's like your plan, it's your blueprint. If you're blessed with more gifts coming in, I'm sure you'll have ideas for how to spend those gifts. And then if you can want to sort of look and see and know if you need to make changes or shifts when things change. And I also liked Bruce's comment that generosity is a choice, based not on a number, but on our capacity to give. So I think that's absolutely true. And we see that, again and again.
Well, what I really like about Bruce's comment of the budget is, if someone was to say to you, oh, you just want us to give because you want to cover the budget. And the answer is, well, it is literally our plan for ministry and mission. So yeah, why would that be a surprise?
Okay, do we have any other comments there? If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question that they feel hasn't been answered yet. Oh, Lori, there's a shout out for your book, that it's great, very worth reading and digesting, and good to have as a resource to go deeper into the topics raised today.
Why, thank you.
Anyone else?
I wanted to thank you all for this. This has been such an excellent experience. And now I am remorseful that I didn't do a better job at promoting this to the rest of my session and board.
Mm.
And so I'm trying to figure out how I can get you.
It will be
how to-
recorded.
I know it will be recorded. It's just not the same as an interactive thing.
Well, if you're quite welcome to invite us, and this is why we do these webinars too. We can invite to your session or board meeting, because then it's a different conversation, but you can say, we want to talk about the topics that we talked about today, even pick and choose exactly if there's ones that you think need to be emphasized, and we'll book a Zoom meeting and talk to you about them. Talk to the
Excellent. And I quickly wanted to give you an illustration about the deficit aspect. Our church has surpluses from many years. And for the last 5 years, we have had a planned deficit that will be covered by the surplus. And every year we have ended the year in a surplus situation again. But this does not keep the doubters from going, no, we can't pass a deficit. No, this is bad. No, that's our money. We need to keep that for a rainy day. And you're trying to tell them, well, this might be the rainy day.
Exactly, yeah.
Can I just say thanks be to God? Because that sounds like a really good response to a story like that.
Thank you. I also found that inviting the people who like to look at postage stamps and LED light bulbs and all of the little tiny ways of saving money to be part of the budgeting process. So this year I had the largest group around the table that I've ever had. And in answer to my question, well, where do you want to cut? Because of course, that is why they're there. They want to figure out where to cut. We wound up with the observation that there was no place to cut. And so I guess we're passing the largest deficit budget we've ever had.
And I think we want to keep the idea on the abundance, on the generosity, allow God to surprise us, which isn't at all to say that we want to be irresponsible, and pass something that's completely out of reach for the congregation. But it's getting people involved in that budgeting thing. It's sometimes you might think it's counterintuitive. Let's have a small group do it. It's easier for them. But you find more people actually then have ownership over the budget. And when it's time to give, they're like, oh, we know what we're giving to. Wow, this is efficient use of funds, because they don't have any extras in it.
Yeah. And I love the idea of a narrative budget, in spite of the fact that it sounds like a lot more work for me. And I'm also thinking that I need to start working on this budget like in May as opposed to November.
That's right. Yeah.
We have some terrific examples of narrative budget materials that you can use on our website.
Okay, thank you. I will go dig for that.
Yeah.
And the big thing is, when you're working on a narrative budget, don't get too hung up on it. Those questions on the intricacies, everything is going to be subjective. You want to get the big picture. You want to be able to do the big picture strokes. So, don't get to about $10 or $20 or small amounts here. You want to say, how or percentage times, just guess. Well, the minister spends, this much time on preparing for worship, this much time visiting people, this much time doing Christian education, this much time in prayer. Yeah. Great. Okay, well, we're a little bit over time, which is not too unusual for my webinars, but thank you so much for all of you who stuck in. And once again, this is brought to you by Gifts to Presbyterian Sharing, and I am very grateful because I see individuals and congregations giving to that, and in times when they have deficits in their congregation themselves, and they have stayed strong with gifts. So thank you very much. Email us if you're interested in talking more.